Linda, you have the you don't have the proper screen. You have the notes showing.
Oh no, let me change that. So hi everyone, thank you for joining us. Do one thing. Does that look great, Suzanne?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. I was trying to see the participants.
Ugh,
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining. We're gonna wait 5 minutes for more people to log in. We're gonna wait a couple more minutes for more people to join. Gonna wait another minute or two and then we'll get started. Right, it is 7:05, so we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Linda Grand, and I'm a program manager for the City of Palo Alto Utilities. Excited to have this webinar tonight. I think a lot of us are comfortable with Zoom, but just a reminder that you can ask your questions two ways. You can put it into the Q&A, and you can also, at the end of the webinar, there will be an opportunity to raise your hand and ask our instructor directly. So we're partnering with BOSCA to hold this webinar. BOSCA represents 26 agencies that include cities, water districts, a water company, and a university, all that purchase water from San Francisco. BOSCA member agencies provide water to 1.8 million people and over 40,000 businesses. BOSCA's goal is a high quality supply of water at a fair price. Outdoor water use represents the single largest untapped opportunity for water conservation in the Bay Area. And we're going to talk about all the ways that you can do that. So if you live here in Palo Alto, we partner with Valley Water on several rebate programs. We have rebates for converting sprinklers to drip irrigation, installing weather-based irrigation controllers. You can get a rebate of up to $4 per square foot for replacing your lawn with drought-tolerant plants. We have also a rebate of $2 per square foot for rain gardens, $400 rebate for a laundry gray water system. We have a up to $70 rebate for a rain barrel, $1 per gallon for cisterns and permeable pavement as well. So for information on rebates in Palo Alto, you can visit cityofpaloalto.org/ways to save. Also want to just do a shout out for our WaterSmart portal. If you live in Palo Alto, you can log on to WaterSmart and view your usage. It is now connected with our smart meter. So if you have gotten a smart meter installed, you can log in and see your daily and hourly usage and also get alerts about leaks or unusual usage. And we also want to just promote that there's free mulch from Hopkins Tennis Courts in Mitchell Park. We also have a compost giveaway station at Eleanor Party Community Garden. You'll be learning a little bit about healthy soils today. Wanted to just mention our heat pump water heater program. So the city has several different ways for you to replace your gas water heater with a clean heat pump water heater. There's the full service program where our installer will do everything for you, and it has the biggest incentive. We also have a rebate program, and if your water heater ends up being an emergency, we have an emergency replacement program as well. If you don't live in Palo Alto, check out BOSCA to find out what your retailer offers. There is a similar landscape conversion rebate of $1 to $4 per square foot and a rain barrel rebate as well. BOSCA also has a smart controller rebate and a rain garden rebate. So if you're not sure what your city or water agency offers, go to bosca.org and you can search by where you live. Join BOSCA for some upcoming classes. You'll have Suzanne again tomorrow to learn about natural pest management. And then there's a garden talk on efficient irrigation practices on December 4th. And then that wraps up BOSCA's fall workshop. So thank you if you have joined any of our previous ones, and we hope to see you in the spring. I am going to stop sharing. I'm going to introduce our instructor, Suzanne Bontempo. So Suzanne works as an environmental educator, teaching the principles of integrated pest management for sustainable, eco-friendly pest management around the home and garden. Suzanne is the owner of Plant Harmony and the IPM Advocate Program, coordinator for Our Water, Our World. She loves teaching folks how to grow bountiful gardens that are also safe and healthy for you. And super excited to have Suzanne here tonight.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to talk to you about something that I personally love a lot. It's growing a lot of food and growing it in a way that is also going to be water wise, water efficient, but then also is going to grow healthy, abundant plants and a nice bounty for us to enjoy. So let's get started. I am going to go through slides for about an hour, and then we'll leave time for your questions at the end. Although I am pausing at one part mid-program to see if there's any questions. I am going to be reviewing how to set your water-wise edible garden up for success. This is really where I will review the basics of sustainable gardening. So this is actually not just for food, it's really how we approach gardening, but this will definitely have a strong food reference. And then we'll talk about which types of plants are the most water-wise and best suited for your garden. I will review the benefits and also things to consider if we're growing food from seed versus starts, which might be better for you. Maybe starts are better, maybe seeds are better. And then we're going to talk about how to maintain and water our plants with water efficient gardening techniques. I will touch on winter fruit tree care. And then just a brief note about pests. Since we're growing food, we're not the only ones that like to eat it. We have a lot of critters out there in the garden that will also enjoy it. So I'll just give you a couple tidbits on that. And then a few helpful gardening resources. And then we'll continue with the rest of the questions. So setting our food gardens up for success. So, a couple of things to consider are the elements of the garden when we are looking at either adding a new garden bed or adding more plants to our existing garden. So, we always want to look at the space that's available and its orientation to the sun, the house, other structures. Uh, and then we also want to consider how we're going to be watering the plants. Will this be watering by hand or will we be watering with an irrigation system? And then we're going to look at uh, the the plant material, which plants are best suited for the type of soil that you have. If we have really heavy clay soil, we're going to keep that in mind. And in fact, if it's so hard that water has a very difficult time infiltrating, we might even consider planting in raised beds on top of that soil. So something to keep in mind. And then yeah, and then that's really and, like, also how the wind is moving through the garden, that's something else to keep in mind because the wind has a tendency to really dry out the, uh, the above ground parts of the plant as opposed to the below ground parts of the plant. So, what is the sun exposure? So, full sun is going to be 6 hours or more of direct sunlight. Part sun, part shade is 3 to 6 hours of direct sun, preferably morning. But now that we're moving into shorter daylight hours, actually, it could be anywhere from that late morning to midday, no problem. It's a little cooler sun. And then dappled sun is going to be filtered sunlight all day, and then shade is no direct sunlight, keeping in mind it could be bright shade or dark shade. Our food crops that we're looking at are going to prefer something that's around full sun, part shade, keeping in mind an area that might have full sun all day long in the summer. Now we've got shorter daylight hours. We're keeping that in mind, but we're also considering it to be that's the full sun part of the garden, even though we've got shorter daylight hours, or the way the sun maybe has moved might be now behind trees a little bit. We're just going to take note of this. All right. We're talking about cool season crops today because we're in the fall, moving towards the winter into early spring season, which is the cool time of the year. And these cool season crops are going to prefer temperatures that are below 75 degrees. If we happen to have a really warm winter, it is not unusual, or an early spring that's really warm, it's not unusual to see these plants start to bolt or push a flower stalk or go into flower early because it's a trigger that their end of that annual plant's life is coming towards its end, and they want to get those seeds out so they can continue to produce themselves. All right. So we're going to look at finding the best location. So depending on what we're growing, root crops like carrots, garlic, onions, turnips, beets, and so forth will prefer to go directly into the ground or into deeper raised beds or larger containers, a container that's maybe 20 inches wide by maybe 24 inches deep, or even a half barrel. We can think about that, something around that size or larger. Uh, leafy greens or things that are growing that have a shallower root zone, like lettuces, arugulas, charred kale, they're very well suited for containers. So if we only have space on our patio or a deck with a few containers, something like the leafy greens would be great. Also, radishes are going to be fairly shallow. They'll grow very well in a shallow area. Um, and then we're going to look at raised beds. Raised beds are going to be another option where we can actually have the best of both worlds. We'll have deeper soil. We can grow a more variety. We won't be limited to maybe the shallowness of a container. Benefits of growing directly into the ground is that it's certainly less expensive. We don't need to build anything. There's no cost. We're just building right. We're just planting right into the ground. Um, we will have more space. Maybe there's more flexibility of space. There's not really any boundaries other than maybe structures or the fence line. And it is certainly not permanent. We can certainly relocate this particular garden bed into other areas, like maybe in the summer there's more sunlight, so maybe we want to grow in a hotter spot for our summer crops, whereas maybe there's an area over here that's maybe shaded in the summer but it's warmer, more direct sunlight in the wintertime, so maybe that's where we put our winter or cool season crops, things like that. Concerns are we're working with the existing soil, so it is always advised that we get our soil tested, but it's not something that we usually do. But keep in mind, it is nice to do. But also, if our soil, like I just mentioned, is really hard packed in clay and not easy to work, then maybe it's not realistic. Also, keep in mind when we're planting directly in the ground, we do have to contend with gophers. Gophers are a serious situation for many of us throughout the Bay Area. I certainly battle with gophers all the time. We're also, when we're planting directly in the ground, we're bending down. So sometimes bending down isn't so comfortable for us. And believe it or not, when we're planting directly in the ground, we're actually going to be using more water because that water is going to move beyond where we're directing or targeting it. All right, raised beds. Raised beds, the benefits, we are able to line those raised beds with gopher wire or half-inch hardware cloth, which is galvanized, which gophers cannot chew through. We can control the soil. So that means we can add really beautiful, nice soil as opposed to working that hard, crummy soil that we might have in our gardens. And believe it or not, when we plant in raised beds, we're using less water because we're watering a contained area. This is also going to go for containers, all right? So we're really able to use less water and water more efficiently when we're growing in raised beds. Some of the concerns with raised beds is the cost of the materials. It can cost about $100 per raised bed, give or take. We're also going to be limited to the growing space. If we build, I've done this before, my first couple of raised beds were either too small or too big, and it wasn't easy I immediately found out what the problems with those dimensions were. So it was kind of permanent. I had to kind of, modify and maybe change what I was using those beds for. And it's not really easy to relocate them. So you're kind of, you want to be really sure of what we're doing, where we're placing these. Okay, in containers, some of the benefits for growing in containers is that they're really great for smaller spaces. They're definitely more mobile. You can move them around. We're not going to have an issue with gophers because they cannot access the metal containers, although with half barrels, my half barrels now, I've got a couple that are a few years old. And guess what? They're the bottoms, I guess, have gotten soft enough that the gophers have entered and ate plants in two of my half barrels. Very disappointed. So now moving forward, I'm just laying out the hardware cloth and putting the barrel on top of it to prevent that from happening again. But if it's a metal or a terracotta or a container that's a little bit harder, like ceramic or a glazed, then oftentimes gophers will not be able to access it unless the hole is large enough. Then we might want to put a little screen over that. We can also control the soil. We're going to be using potting soil in these containers. We're also going to be using less water, as I mentioned. But we do, if we are getting one of the galvanized containers, which are very economical and very lightweight, we do want to drill holes in the bottom. The holes will be about 1/4 of an inch, and we want to have several. If we are planting in terracotta pots, keep in mind that the terracotta will dry faster. It actually wicks the water. This is actually really helpful during the rainy season. However, in the summer, we might need to water more frequently. And then black pots are going to retain heat more, which again could be really great during the winter months. Maybe the summer months, it can be too hot. So just things to keep in mind. And then we want to look at placement. Where are we going to have our garden? If it's up against a fence or the side of the garage or the side of a house, and it's south facing, or it gets like that direct midday to afternoon sun, it might get too hot. So that's something to keep in mind. But maybe this time of the year, that's ideal. All right. So now let's look at plant selection and planting. So we're always going to start with what do we like to eat? And as we become more confident with our abilities and we're able to then experiment and explore more options. But if you're brand new to growing food, we always want to recommend that you start small. Perhaps just start with that half barrel or a single raised bed. The raised beds that I think work really well, at least for me, comfort wise, is 3 feet wide by about 5 feet long. 4 feet would be the max. It does get a little difficult to reach across. And then, of course, the length can be, 6 to 8 feet, whatever you have room for. But I started with 3 by 5 was my perfect formulation, perfect size after I had some other mistakes. And typically, my raised beds are about 18 inches tall or so, uh, just to make it kind of comfortable. But we're always going to start small. Even some containers will be great. We're going to start with the things we like to eat. And if we're, again, really new to gardening, let's just start with a couple of really maybe easier plants to grow. Like maybe if you like leafy greens, maybe starting with chard or lettuce or kale, and just see how that goes. Of course, doing a little reading about the needs of that plant, maybe going to your local garden center and talking to the professionals there about what those plants might need. How simple does it feel? Is it something you feel like you can tackle? And be prepared for things not to always work out the way we expected, but please try to understand that that is the norm. All right. So don't get disappointed. This is how we learn as gardeners. Things are, even me, I've been growing food for close to 20 years, and life happens, and we can't always get to our food crops in a timely fashion, or maybe something, a weather event happened or something else happened, irrigation break. So just that's how we learn as gardeners, and then these are the stories that we share. So don't give up or get discouraged. But here's the thing, we live in California, which is a Mediterranean climate. That means we experience a wet winter season and a very long, dry summer season. So, some of the best food choices for us to plant would be heirloom varieties. They are ideal for our California climate. And the reason why is that heirloom varieties are oftentimes and mostly from Mediterranean parts of the world, which is where we live right here. They're also typically going to be more drought tolerant, uh, drought and heat in some cases, but drought tolerant. And the main reason why is their root zones are going to be deeper divers. So we can really grow deeper root zones, water deeply, which means we won't have to water as often. So we're really just giving the plants a real nice deep soak, and then bam, we're good for a while. And really by August, I have reduced my watering my tomatoes to about once a week, even during the excessive heat days, because I know I've got nice, deep, healthy root zones. And then as we move into the cooler season, now it's the perfect time to plant the cool season food crops like our alliums, which is our garlic, onion, and shallots. I just put my garlic and shallots in. I'm about to get some onions in. I just put out some bunching onions or scallion seeds. So this is really, we are right on time. The brassicas, like the cabbage, the broccolis, the turnips, bok choys, and so forth. This is a great time to get those plants in. And then, of course, leafy greens like our chard, our kale, our lettuces, even radishes. We are right on target. And there's many different types of food plants that we can grow, and many of them are going to be annual food crops. So annual food crops are a specific because they have a 1 year life cycle or even a little shorter, maybe a 1 season life cycle. So in the case of chard or kale, you might see them actually having a little bit more longevity. They can actually go through almost an entire year before they bolt and go to seed and distribute their seeds around the garden. Whereas lettuces, they're going to be a little shorter seasoned. And in fact, oftentimes we'll get to eating the plant before their whole life cycle has completed. Radishes are very quick. We plant them, and it's really, I think it's like within 2 weeks, we've got some food to enjoy in our salads. And then we have perennial food crops, and these are the true water savers. Um, these are going to be plants that we're planting in one permanent location. Unless we choose to move it, it has to get relocated for some reason. The perennial plants are going to have a 3 year or longer lifespan. And once these plants are established, they are going to require less water and less resources in the form of frequency of fertilizing or attention for care. They are really going to be a lot more low maintenance, but they're still going to be providing an abundance of food for us. So plants like strawberries, artichokes, bunching onions, or scallions, those are perennials, something I learned recently. Asparagus, chives are even perennials. These are all plants that we're planting once, and then they're really going to thrive on their own with not a lot of care from us. And if you enjoy eating leafy greens like kale, then a tree collard or a tree kale is the perfect plant for you. I don't have one pictured here, but I did have one growing for quite a long time, and it got ginormous. And let me tell you, it is called a tree collard, but the leafy greens are more like kale. And one plant produces a lot of food for pretty much the year round season. So you get a lot of bang for your buck. And then bare root season is right around the corner. This is when garden centers bring in plants that are bare root because it's a plant that's dormant. Mm, excuse me. A plant that's dormant, so it can sell it as a bare root, not in soil. And this is going to be berries, blueberries, caneberries, strawberries, fruiting vines, deciduous fruit trees, also perennial vegetables like the ones I just mentioned. So this is all a great opportunity to get these plants at a very good price and get them established in your garden now for years of bounty. So I bought these spare root strawberries. Gosh, it's got to be about 8 years ago. And they're still producing delicious fruit with not a lot of care, other than I don't know, about a couple years ago, I actually divided them up and split them and put them a couple different pots. This year, I had some things going on, so I was not out there watering. They did not get very much water at all, but beyond maybe once a week, even during the really hot days. They don't look great, but they're still thriving. So they're tough. They're going to be hardy. They do like to get water, but they also like their soil to dry out between watering, and they will benefit from maybe once a month or so liquid fertilizing during the growing season. So just a couple things to keep in mind, but they'll just keep going year after year. And many of the garden herbs that we enjoy are so easy to grow and quite water wise. Cilantro and parsley, they really will reseed and thrive. And again, really like that soil to dry out between watering. Rosemary, oregano, thyme, more perennial herbs and shrubs that are going to also thrive in our gardens. So keep that in mind. All right, now we're going to look at the different ways we can bring plants into our garden. So we can look at growing plants from seed versus growing plants from an individual start, a little tiny pot, a cell pack, and so forth. So growing from seeds, I would say this could be, in some ways, could be very easy. Sometimes, I have gotten discouraged that maybe I didn't have the timing right, or I accidentally let the seeds dry out. So in some cases, it could be a little bit more complicated. They definitely need a little bit more attention, but in other ways, they're very easy, very economical. You get a lot of seeds per pack, so you can potentially grow a lot of plants. Um, the seed pack has a lot of very important information, such as recommendations for what time of the year to start the seeds, and also if it's best to start them in starting trays or if it's best just to direct sow them. So, read the packet, see if that's something that you are comfortable doing and that you could take it on. It's also going to share what season to sow the seeds relative to last frost date and first frost date is usually how it's set up. And then the other option would be buying the plants or buying starts. So this is where we see like maybe a single plant in like a 4-inch pot, or like a cell pack where there's like maybe 4 little cells or 6 cells and a little individual thing that we purchase. There's a lot of benefits here too, because though it might cost as much as a pack of seeds, maybe even more, um, you're just getting one plant. It's already mature, so we're saving a little time. So if it's late in the season, maybe we don't have time to sow seeds. Um, for whatever reason, maybe we just want to start off with the plant, get it in, we have it, it's already going, we don't need to mess around. Something else to consider is that if we don't have a lot of space, maybe we just want one plant. Maybe we want to not have a bunch of plants of the same variety. So when we're buying individual plants, we can actually have, if we've only got space for 3 plants, we can have 3 different things that can grow really well together. So just keep that in mind, that there's some benefits to both and some things to consider. But when I'm buying, I grow both from seed and I will buy plants. But when I'm out there looking for plants, if I see a particular little 4-inch pot or a cell pack that has several plants in it, then that to me is high value, because in the case of this 6-pack of lettuce, uh, I think the grower just ran out of time because it was spring and there's just not a lot of extra time. So they didn't thin the plants. So this 6-pack that cost me about $5 actually had about 4 little seedlings per cell. So that once I very patiently divided up all of the plants with tender care, I had about 30 plants. So that I found was really good value. So those are just kind of some things I like to look for. Again, the seed packs and those plant tags are going to be really important. It gives us a lot of good planting information, like the number of days to harvest, the time of year to plant, how big that plant's going to get, water requirements, and sun exposure. So please make sure when we're buying plants, we always have that tag and that we are taking notes and putting these notes into our gardening journals. All right. So when we buy plants, or once those plants from seeds have gotten, they're outgrown their little container, they're ready to go, we're going to pull those plants out of their container. And before we transplant them into the garden bed or the larger container, we want to just make sure we've opened up that root zone a little bit. We're going to grab the little plant tag and just score those roots, just kind of like wiggle them a little bit, because we want to make sure those roots are going to start to grow out. Okay. We do want to be gentle, but we also want to make sure there's not a knot of the root ball is not in a knot. And we do this before planting. And then I like to plant my annual food crops on a hex pattern so that I can get more plants into a smaller space. This is also going to save water. We'll water less often when we water plants. When we have planted plants this way, we're using less water. Why? Because the plants, as they grow, are going to shade the soil, which reduces water evaporation. When we are when that soil is able to stay moist for longer, we don't need to water as often. So remember, we want to always water deeply, but we don't want to water again until the soil has dried out. Some plants want the soil to dry out moderately. Some plants, like citrus, really want the soil to dry out significantly before it gets watered again. Um, for in the case of the leafy greens, we're letting that soil dry out pretty well. We don't want it quite bone dry, but we're not watering again until it's just about bone dry. So it's something to keep in mind. When we also grow this way on that hex pattern and these plants have filled up the space, those leaves are actually regulating the temperatures underneath. It's kind of, you can think of it like a rainforest or an overhang that's protecting the temperatures below. The soil is going to stay cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter when the plants are growing this way. And then when I harvest, I'm always harvesting the outer larger leaves of these plants as I go, which will thin it naturally and then allow those next group of leaves to grow. So I'm only, I'll be leaving a section, at least half the plant, if not more, inside, existing. I've only removed the outer leaves. So then the plant can continue to grow with ease, regulating the soil temperatures and reducing that water evaporation. And then for annual food crops that are fast growers, like I mentioned, lettuce and radishes, for instance, it is really important to keep in mind if we want a longer harvest season, we want to practice succession planting. So this is recommended for the fast growing annual food crops. Um, this extends our harvest season and it allows us to have food for a longer period of time, but we have to plan it out a little bit. It does require a little bit of planning. And then when we're direct sowing in the ground or in a raised bed or a container, so similar to that 6-pack of lettuce that I showed you a moment ago, all those seeds are going to germinate and then they're going to be really crowded. So it's really important when we're direct sowing seeds, we need to go through and thin those plants out. You can transplant them to another area of the garden, but by all means, we want to thin it out. In this case, it's parsley, and there's too many plants. They're all growing together with their root zones right next to each other. What this is going to cause, it's going to lead plants. It's going to make plants a little stretched because they're stretching up to reach sunlight. The plants are going to, in some cases, be weaker. And in some cases, they'll be discolored, maybe not as dark enough green as they would be if they had a little bit more space because they're not getting enough sun exposure. And then cover crops are an excellent way to protect and nurture the soil between planting seasons. So these are ideal for any planting beds that are empty from like, let's say the summer season. Maybe you had 4 raised beds or containers of food crops from the summer season, and now you're like, well, that was a lot of work, and it's shorter daylight hours, and it's kind of cooler, and I don't really want to grow that much food over the winter, so I'm just going to do one raised bed or one container. Don't leave the other ones empty, okay? Keep in mind that soil is alive and it needs something growing in it other than weeds to nurture it. So cover crops protect the soil from erosion and continue to feed the microbiology. They replenish the nitrogen in the soil and improve the soil structure and its water holding capacity. And this is what we're always aiming for, right? We always want to build and nurture healthy soil so that we can really allow that soil to act like a sponge in all the good ways of holding in that water for a longer period of time, but also have these uh, pore spaces that have air and where roots can move through with ease. So this is what the cover crops do. They really help nurture that soil. My favorite cover crop to grow, which I find to be the easiest, is fava beans. Fava beans, you can buy them in bulk or at your local garden center. And they are going to thrive in our mild, cool fall through spring season climate. I dot them around. I will put them in, especially any raised beds or garden beds that I had my summer food crops. If I'm not growing a winter food crop, I'm definitely growing fava beans in those areas so that I could cut them at the base next spring before I put my next summer crop in. And I love fava beans because the tips, when they're young, you can cut a couple inches off the tips and saute them with a little garlic and sesame oil or put them in your chopped salads. They're delicious. But something we don't want to forget about are the flowers. So, as much as we love growing food, it is really important to also include flowers around our raised beds or around our gardens in close proximity, or even having one little plant, flowering plant in with our food crops if it's a container, or having a container of flowers next to that food container. And the reason why is because we do get some warm days during the fall, winter, and early spring. And on these warm days, it's not unusual to see pollinators out there, visiting flowers, harvesting pollen and nectar, as well as beneficial insects are going to anyone that's active. If it's a warm spring, I mean, if it's a couple of warm days, we might even see ladybugs getting active. Um, adult lady beetles are going to require nectar and pollen from flowers as an alternative food source. The adults are not only eating the pest insects like aphids, they actually are going for nectar and pollen as well as the protein meal. So when we have flowers that are in bloom throughout the year, then we're able to also support the pollinators that come and visit. When we have pollinators visiting, then we're also going to have our insurance that will have our food crops will get fertilized properly, and that we will also be inviting beneficial bugs that will be keeping the balance in the garden. Okay, so we're going to look at varieties that are grow in clusters of small flowers like sweet alyssum and yarrow, ceanothus. And I will tell you that sweet alyssum and my yarrow pretty much is in bloom almost all year. Pretty much. I mean, maybe there's like end of winter, beginning of spring, the yarrow has been cut back. Maybe it's not in bloom, but it is pretty much year round. Sweet alyssum is almost year round. Um, and then, of course, things that look like a daisy or a sunflower, because the petals that we see, those are actually the rays, and it's the little button of flowers in the middle. Those are the tiny flowers that attract our small pollinators and beneficials. Herbs going to flower is also a really great way. Those are great flowers to offer our garden friends. Okay, so before I talk about building soil health and nurturing the garden health overall, Linda, are there any questions that have come up?
I see one. Vanessa wants to know about reasons to have your soil tested. Is it pH or toxic substances or something else?
Oh, that's a really great question. It's always nice to get the soil tested, and it's not necessarily the pH, but when we get our soil tested, it's a baseline to understand what that soil needs. So, um, I like to think of it as, I don't know, like the vitamins in the soil. It's not exactly that. It's just that's my analogy. But when I get a soil test, it tells me if there's high calcium level or low calcium level, or if there's a high phosphorus level or low phosphorus level. And these are always really important as I'm moving when I'm going to be which we'll be talking about next, adding compost and fertilizer to the soil. If I've got high phosphorus, then I don't need to add any extra phosphorus, for instance. Or if I've got low phosphorus or low calcium, then I'm going to want to make sure I'm adding more of that. The other thing to keep in mind is that there are some areas of the Bay Area where the soil maybe was used at one point as a dump, or maybe it was near a like the naval base where the soil maybe had a lot of equipment on it. So there are areas of the Bay Area that it is advised to grow eh, grow any food crops in raised beds. But I imagine if um, you are, you most likely know that information when you're when if you own or rent the property that you're at. But it is nice just to get the soil tested. I always get really curious about it. It is not something that that seems really popular, but it is really important.
I see one more question, and this might be something you get into in this next section, but you mentioned you cut plants at the base going from season to season. Can you mention more about soil preparation between seasons?
Yes, I will be getting into that in a moment, but that's really just the cover crops. So I'm just cutting cover crops at the base right when they start going to flower. That is if it's the fava beans or any of the other legumes, because they've captured nitrogen from the air and they have it stored in the root zone in the form of little nodes. And if I want to keep that nitrogen in the soil, then I'm going to cut the plant at the base right when it starts to go to flower, because I don't want the plant to take up and use the nitrogen it had just captured. I want to keep that nitrogen for my next season of plants. So
Great. And we
let's,
have we have a
oh yeah.
quick follow-up on recommendations on where to get soil tested.
Um, I would there, yeah, I would do an online search. I would reach out to a local soil yard like Linkso and ask who they would recommend. I would also look on the local UC Master Gardeners website. Those are the three places that really going to the UC Master Gardeners website or calling a place like Linkso, those are going to give you more direct resources that's local. And then doing an online search, you might get resources for places that are a little further away.
Great. If that's all the questions now.
All right, super. Okay, so we want to always be uh, looking at how we can build the health of our soil. The soil is the foundation of our plants. It's the foundation of our garden, literally and figuratively. So we build the health of the soil by adding compost. And compost is organic matter that has been eaten up by bacteria and fungi and microbes and worms and other decomposers. Okay. When we add compost to the soil, it improves that soil structure. It is also going to increase that water retention. It's going to increase the microbiology, which means we're going to have healthier root zones and we're going to have more efficient nutrient and water uptake by those roots for that plant. When we add compost, compost naturally balances the pH levels. So, in regards to the soil testing, this is why I didn't address the pH part of your question so much. When we're adding compost to the soil, that compost is actually it's recycled nutrients, okay? And it also reduces the need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Compost naturally fight pathogens and bad bacteria in the soil. The way we add compost to the soil is either we're mixing it in at time of planting, or we are top dressing around the drip line, around, right on top of where the root zone is for plants that are already established, such as those perennial food plants that we've already discussed, fruit trees, vines, and so forth. We can also make a compost tea and apply it as a soil drench. Sometimes that's a little bit more complicated, but really adding it at time of planting and putting it around the root zone of plants is the best way to get it into the soil. And we add compost because we want to increase that biology in the soil in the form of the bacteria and the fungi. Plants can't take up nutrients in the soil without this microbiology. It's kind of like our gut microbiome. It's really important that microbiology around that's in the soil that exists around the root zones of these plants um, literally will when we add fertilizer to the soil, they actually will feed on the fertilizer, digest the fertilizer, and then release it in a form that the plants can readily absorb. So that is why we're always looking to nurture the life in the soil. The microbiology has specific relationships with plants. They build these symbiotic relationships. So the microbiology around your tomato plant will be different than the microbiology around the kale, for instance. And the bacteria and the fungi are going to not only assist with breaking down the organic materials, but they're also going to assist with storing the nutrients in the soil. They're also going to assist with breaking down toxins and pollutants, and they're going to assist with holding that soil together. So again, imagine that sponge and all the webbing of the sponge. That's webbing is a little bit like what the bacteria and the fungi are doing. They're helping holding all the organic matter pieces, the mineral pieces of the soil together so it doesn't just like wash away or fall apart. And we can certainly make our own compost at home. Or we can buy it. We can buy soil or compost in bulk and have it delivered to us, or we could pick it up with the truck, or we could buy it in bags. But when we buy compost in bags, I just want to share a couple of things because all the bags have a little bit of a different name on it. So the bags will read planting mix or planting compost or garden compost, soil amendment, soil booster. These are all things that we want to add to in-ground planting to amend the soil or add to, well, if it's a raised bed, we're going to add planting mix or raised bed mix. And then every season that we're adding new plants, we'll be amending it with one of the garden compost or soil amendment or soil booster. If we're growing in containers, then we are going to get something that says potting soil. Potting soil is going to be for pots and containers, not for raised beds, not for in-ground planting. All right, and then how we feed our plants. We want to feed with organic fertilizers. And why organic fertilizers? Well, um, organic fertilizers are going to be the most sustainable way to feed our plants. And over time, big picture, they're less expensive. And it really takes less effort. What are organic fertilizers? Well, they're derived from organic matter, such as manures or compost, kelp, maybe fish, like fish bones, um, other bones, blood meal, alfalfa meal, cottonseed meal. They're not derived from fossil fuels. So usually when we're reading the bag or the box, we actually know what all those ingredients are. They're just things we recognize. They oftentimes have lower NPK numbers. This is the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. These are the macronutrients, and they also are going to contain micronutrients as well. So organic fertilizers are typically like a multivitamin. So we apply organic fertilizers to the garden to increase the health of the plants and the soil. They're equally supporting and nurturing the soil as much as they are the plants. So this is an illustration of how plants access those nutrients. And this is organic fertilizers versus synthetics. So on the left, we have organic fertilizers. They're actually feeding the soil microbiology that I just mentioned. And then the microorganisms have that relationship with the root zone of the plant so that plants can really absorb those nutrients on an as-need basis. It's sustainable. It allows that plant to grow at a very natural rate. Um, and it's less stressful for the plant, and it really grows a more resilient plant that can handle stresses that come with weather events and so forth. When we feed with synthetic or chemical fertilizers, keep in mind they are bypassing that soil medium, bypassing the microbiology, and directly feeding the root zone. Um, the cautions with this is that on that package, if it says to feed every 4 weeks, it is very important that we feed every 4 weeks. If we happen to miss it because we're out of town or it's too cold outside or too hot or um, there's like a school play we need to go to, or we're under the weather, or something came up, or we just forgot, that plant is essentially getting really hungry for food. And I don't know how you feel when you've missed your lunch, if you get the hangries, well, the plants get the hangries too. So it's really important if we are choose to feed synthetically, which is not my recommendation, but we have to feed in accordance to that schedule. Because of this, or one of the reasons, is that this then becomes more expensive than feeding organically. Also, synthetic fertilizers have a tendency to be higher in salts, which can be really detrimental to those root zones and actually reducing its ability to take in those nutrients efficiently, as we saw before. And they come from, fossil fuels and other things. So it's just a more sustainable way to feed organically. And then something that's kind of in between fertilizer and compost is worm castings. And they assist with growing a very resilient plant because they contain an abundance of nutrients and minerals essential for plants to thrive. It's essentially a superfood for your plants. They contain important enzymes and beneficial bacteria and humus that provides dynamic root growth and plant structure, highly effective for preventing insect pests and diseases, and neutralizes the higher pHs. Just a tablespoon or a quarter of a cup of worm castings per plant at time of planting, maybe doing a little top dressing seasonally, is really going to show a healthier plant overall. It's amazing. And the way we work these products into the soil, or the way we use these products, I mentioned compost, we could just top dress around the root zone for established plants, or we're mixing it at time of planting. At time of planting, we're also going to be mixing in the earthworm or the worm castings and the dry fertilizer. But for plants that are already established, like your artichokes or your fruit trees, we're going to put the fertilizer down around the outer edges, right above that root zone, maybe scratch it in a little bit, being mindful that we don't disturb the roots. And then we're going to put, like a nice inch or two of compost on top of that. And then we'll top dress with mulch again. So with perennial plants, with our fruit trees, with our berries, our fruiting vines, generally we're just doing this right before and or right after it's produced food. So for my deciduous fruit trees like apples, right now is when I am doing that process, and I'm not doing it again. So I'm really just doing it once a year. Okay, but we also can feed with liquid fertilizers, and this is really ideal for annual food crops that have a shorter lifespan and that actually kind of may require a little bit more food. So anything that gives me food, I need to be mindful that I need to feed. But if something's faster growing, or if it's an evergreen food crop like citrus, they really need a little bit more fertilizer. So in addition to the dry fertilizer and that compost, during the growing season, I'm going to feed with liquid fertilizer. Also, if I'm growing in a container, keep in mind every time I water or if it rains, the nutrients get leached out. So I'm going to want to fertilize as well. And I do this by just mixing that fertilizer in a watering can with water, reading the label and mixing it in accordance to what the label says. And I might apply it about every other week, maybe once a month. Whatever the label says is what I'm going to do. And that's the easiest way to manage that. And then in addition to building soil health, we want to protect that soil. And the way we do that is by using mulch. And mulch is any material that's spread over the surface as kind of a covering or a blanket. And it can be made of tree bark or wood chips, leaves that are falling right now, lawn clippings, straw, newspaper, oyster shells, gravel, landscape fabric, or rubber. However, if we really want to support the health of the soil, we want to only focus on the things highlighted in red here. So my personal favorites are going to be like an arbor mulch or a wood chip mulch or even rice straw. A rice straw is something you can get at the feed store, not always easy or convenient for some of us. But so any of those are going to work. Those are my three go-tos. But we want to be mindful to avoid anything that's dyed, though the dye is not harmful. It's just vegetable based. Sometimes the dyes are going to leach into the food. So then the food could take on that color and then we might think something's wrong. So just something to keep in mind. They can also stain patio stone or concrete or flagstone. And then something that's really important, I mean, beyond all the things I just mentioned, mulch is going to provide so many benefits to the garden and to the soil. Keep in mind that soil, when it doesn't have a nice blanket of mulch on top of it, it dries out. The top part of it will really dry out because of air and sun. And it can make it very hydrophobic, meaning that the water will not penetrate. In fact, in some cases, the soil can be so hard, it's even difficult to get a shovel into the soil. So when we have that nice 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch on top of the soil, we're going to be protecting that soil. We're going to allow the water to actually infiltrate. It will not run off when we've got that soil on there. In fact, when we've got that mulch on there, in fact, the mulch is going to prevent erosion. We're also going to reduce that water evaporation rate. So again, we don't need to water as often. In fact, we're going to be reducing the frequency of watering up to 70%. So in some cases it can be less, but just keep in mind, like when we've got mulch on our soil, we really want to make sure that soil is dried before we start watering because we don't need to water as often at all. We'll be saving so much water. Um, Also, that 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch is going to insulate the root zone, keeping it warmer through the winter months and cooler during the summer months. And as that mulch breaks down, it's actually feeding the microbiology in the soil. It's providing habitat for beneficial insects to take harborage over, inclement weather or during the, colder days. And the big takeaway is that we just want to make sure we're not bringing mulch up next to any parts of the plant. And then how to water efficiently. We're going to talk about watering. Some of us might be hand watering it. Some of us might be using an irrigation system. Maybe we've got soaker hoses around. There's a lot of different ways to water, but really the same goal is in mind that we want to make sure we're targeting the root zone and watering the soil around that root zone in a way that is going to allow the plants to absorb that water when it needs it. So keep in mind, as plants grow, the root zones are also growing. So we will direct the water to focus on where the roots are. But guess what? We can't really see the roots, right? So what we're always going to think about is it might be a little silly, but however much plant is above ground, we're going to think maybe that's about how much root is below ground. But then we're also going to say, oh, then maybe whatever's above ground might also be as wide as what's below ground. So in this photo right here on the far right, that little seed has just germinated and it's just barely a quarter of an inch out of the soil. And that root zone is just barely 1/4 of an inch. So this still might need to get watered maybe with a water mister twice a day. We just want to make sure it's evenly moist, not really drying out. It's too vulnerable to dry out yet. But by the time it's 4 inches tall on the far right, the root zone is about 4 inches deep. Well, guess what? We're going to water once a day, maybe not even once a day, maybe it's every other day now, where we've watered it and we're not watering until at least the top third of that root zone has dried out. So we want to water deeply to grow deep roots. I love this image from Robert Corrick's book, Roots Demystified. Highly recommend it. It gives us an idea of how deep and broad roots from our plants can grow because we can't see. Keep in mind this snapshot from his book is the square grid is in feet, not inches. So that's how broad the roots can grow. So that's why we're focusing the water and the feeding out at the outer edges of the roots. So as I mentioned earlier, at the time of planting, we want to loosen up that root zone some before we plant it to help those roots to begin to grow out and down as they become established. So we're going to use water to help grow deep, broad root zones. We focus the water on the outer edges of that plant. This is called the drip line. So in the picture that you can see in the top right image, that the gray, those are the root hairs that are expanding beyond that blue line. But it's that band that's from the outer side of the green canopy out to the blue line. That's where we're focusing the water and our feeding when we feed. When we fertilize, that's where it all goes. That's where the compost goes. That's where the mulch is going on top. And then beyond, the mulch will be covering the soil beyond. Um, so this is just where I want to show this is what it looks like in all the different sizes or vantage points. We want to always water deeply, and we're not watering again until the soil has dried out several inches, depending on the size of the plant, the depth of the root zone, and how established it is. So, in the case of many established trees and shrubs, such as citrus, that soil wants to dry out a good 4 to 6 inches before we water again. And this is really hard. The reason why I keep mentioning a lot of this is because the average person overwaters their plants, and that's not saving water. It's wasting water, but it's also threatening the life of the plants, and it's causing the plants to be kind of stressed. So newly plants are going to require more water than you would think, especially the first time we plant. So we're planting that plant, we're watering, we're really saturating the soil. But as the plant becomes established, we don't need to water as frequently. We can back off, but we're still going to be providing that deep water and imagining that the roots have grown a little bit further down. So again, this is just another image. We don't necessarily need to use those little tubes that is represented in this image. I just want to show you how we want to water so that we can have nice, even, deep watering all the way around. And then we're not watering again. And then now until that top several inches is dried out, we're growing a very resilient plant that is not getting watered as frequently as we might imagine. And there's different, if we have irrigation and we have different types of emitters on our property, understand that they all are going to have different flow rates. So the picture on the left is emitter coming off of spaghetti tubing or 1/4 inch tubing. That emitter could have a flow rate of a half a gallon per hour or a gallon or 2 gallons per hour. If you're unsure, then dig a little hole in the soil, put a little deli container, and then watch the irrigation cycle go on and see how much water came out. So you kind of have an idea of how much water is saturating the soil. Same with the picture on the right. That is the half-inch PE tubing. Oftentimes the quarter-inch tubing will be coming off of it, but in some cases, this tubing will have emitters that are spaced about every foot or so. There's a lot of different types of ways to get water out in the gardens with irrigation systems, but the takeaway from this is to, though your landscaper maybe set it up, they maybe didn't explain to you, or maybe we didn't know to ask because it's a little overwhelming sometimes how much water is coming out of those emitters because we want to make sure we're watering our plants in this fashion. We really want to get that water deep enough to thoroughly saturate the roots. Then we're not watering again until the soil has dried. And we absolutely want to avoid this. This is a huge mistake. We do not want the emitter at the base of the plant or the crown. This is where the trunk and the root zone meet. We want to make sure it's always at that outer edge. This actually would cause a lot of problems for this plant and definitely shortening its lifespan to just a couple of years before it dies. But then you're like, how the heck am I going to know if I'm overwatering? Boy, this is a lot of information. Well, guess what? It can be really simple. We either are going to put our fingers in the soil, and if we're not comfortable with that, we can get like something I like to use chopsticks, like the to-go chopsticks that you get when you get some yummy takeout food. Those are very porous. I like to put those in the soil, and when I pull them out, I can see where the watermark is on that little wooden stick. Any wooden stick similar to that will work perfectly. Um, and then you can also buy moisture meters. I actually have them in my house plants. It really helps me to remember when to water my house plants because yeah, it's a tool that really it's made to help us out. So let's use these tools. But the takeaway here is that we really want to make sure we understand that that soil is dry before we water again. And then irrigation systems take advantage of those amazing rebates that Linda mentioned at the beginning of the program. They're fantastic and they make our lives so much easier. They're very easy to use. But here the takeaway is if we have an irrigation system, they are not set it and forget it systems. Unless you have a smart controller, which we're pretty much just setting one time, and then they're going to adjust during the seasons. But if we have an older model, we do want to adjust it to the seasons. We always want to, when we are watering, we want to make sure we're watering in the early hours of the day when the air and the soil temperatures are still cool. We want to avoid watering in the middle of the night because through the lens of a pest educator, that's going to attract more pests such as earwigs, slugs, and snails. So just a couple things to keep in mind. And then the new norm is for us to have insurance for watering through the dry summer months, or even if we have a really dry winter. So, we're just starting to get rains, but if this is it, then maybe we don't want to turn those irrigation systems off yet. Or maybe we've turned them off, but we might need to turn them back on. And another thing to keep in mind is if we can capture rainwater, this is free water for us that we can then use later to water our gardens. 1 inch of rain over 1,000 square foot surface, we're able to capture over 600 gallons of water. So, something else to keep in mind is installing a rain garden. A rain garden will divert overflow from maybe the gutter or a rain barrel and get it into areas of the garden where it can really have a larger impact, like in front of a bank of hedges or trees or around your grove of fruit trees, wherever you have like maybe deep trees and shrubs that might have a deeper root zone. That's an ideal place to have a rain garden in close proximity because that rain garden is going to take that water, spread that water out, slow that water down, and allow that water to slowly infiltrate deeper, recharging the deeper aquifers and groundwater that we have. And then, of course, another thing to keep in mind is if we're adding any new hardscaping to our gardens, like pathways and such, even driveways, walkways, please consider increasing pervious surfaces. We want the pervious surface. We want that water to absorb into the ground and not run off our property. We kind of want to be stingy with our water. We want to be as stingy as possible with the water that's coming from the sky. We want to keep it on our properties. We don't want it to overflow or impact the storm drains. Let's keep it on our property. Let's reduce the municipal water use. Let's use what we can capture. This is the new way. So, couple notes about winter fruit tree care. So for citrus and other evergreen fruits, we are going to, it's perfect time of year to side dress with that compost or chicken manure and or earthworm castings, and then put that nice 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch on top. We want to thin the fruit because if it's heavy and we have a wind event, it can break a branch. And then we do want to protect some of these tropical or semi-tropical plants from frost. So citrus has a tendency, it can withstand a light frost, but not a hard frost. So we just want to be always better safe to be sorry, cover with a frost blanket or with some row cover. And really make sure if we've got anything in containers, we want to make sure those containers are draining. So get like a screwdriver and make sure those holes are clear. So make sure the water is draining. We certainly don't want to have any of our food crops or trees in containers that are not draining, because that could really cause a problem. And then with our deciduous fruit trees, like the plums, the apples, and so forth, this is also a great time of year to put that nice layer of mulch or manure underneath the that nice layer of compost or manure underneath that nice layer of mulch. And then we're going to remove any remaining fruit that's hanging on the trees because it could be problematic by harboring any pest insects or diseases, but then also anything that's fallen on the ground also can be a vector for, other insects, urban critters and such that we just don't really want to invite. We also are moving towards the winter months where deciduous fruit trees would benefit from getting pruned. Of course, cherries and apricots are summer pruners. We always prune them right after the fruit harvest. So if you've got a cherry or an apricot, do not prune them now. Wait until there is definitely a little week of heat, maybe a week or two of heat before we prune again, but it would be advised maybe to wait on that. And then this is also, we're moving towards the dormant season to apply a dormant application of a horticultural oil or copper if needed on those trees to manage any excessive insects or diseases that that plant may be experienced over the past season. And then I'm not talking about pruning fruit trees, but I want to point out that this book is amazing how to prune fruit trees. It now comes with a section on roses. But this is one of the best books, and I know you can buy it at any of the garden centers in the area, and even possibly the Ace Hardware, the Hassett's Ace might have that as well. So check that out. And a brief note about garden pests, because when we grow plants, especially food, there are critters in our garden that also like to enjoy the food that we're growing. So identification is key. If we cannot identify the pest, then it's going to be very difficult to manage it. And then we also want to evaluate our threshold of tolerance. Is the damage just happening to the part of the plant that we're not eating? Then what's the harm? If it's happening to the part of the plant we are eating, then maybe I want to take some action. It is a rare occasion we need to use a pesticide. Oftentimes, in this case, working with barriers, inspecting, monitoring, physically wiping the leaf miner eggs off the leaves, maybe putting that nice thick layer of mulch around our plants to prevent slugs and snails from accessing. Just let's look at different ways we can make a barrier. If we do apply a pesticide, always go with the least toxic and only spot apply. We don't need to spray down the whole garden, and we always want to avoid applying a pesticide to anything that's in flower. And then this is a little bit more of what prevention looks like. Row cover and gopher baskets and netting and exclusion frames. These are all very effective ways to manage pest problems, and we're not using pesticides. And then some resources that you can access for pest management would be the Our Water, Our World website, and then the University of California statewide IPM program. These two websites are going to provide a wealth of information on how to manage our pests around our home and garden. And then also bugguide.net helps with insect identification, and the National Pesticide Information Center helps us understand the active ingredient in the pesticide that we might have, how its mode of action is, how it's intended to be applied, and what are any of the unintended risks. And some of my favorite garden reference books are How to Grow More Vegetables by John Jevons, and the Golden Gate Gardening book by Pam Pierce. That is probably, if you don't have any others, that might be the very one most important one you should have in your library. Please go to your local public library to check it out. It is really fantastic and tells us everything we need. And then, of course, any of the Sunset Western Garden books that are out there, you can get at maybe your local library or at a garage sale. But this one, that's the Book of Edibles, is really fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us. Happy to finish with any other questions that might have come up. And if questions come up later, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm Suzanne at Plant Harmony. My website, which is plantharmony.org, has a lot of this information that I already talked about. So it's really designed and geared towards helping folks grow beautiful gardens with that are always water wise and are always really healthy for you, your family, and the environment.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. I see two questions. First is to clarify, why shouldn't potting soil be used in planting beds?
Potting soil usually has things like perlite and vermiculite. Perlite are those little white beads. Those are not going to break down. So that ends up kind of being a little bit of a problem. Problem being that potting soil is also designed to have a lot more fluffier ingredients in it to really help that water drain. And oftentimes when we are in the raised bed or in ground, we don't need the soil to drain that quickly. We really want to hold on to some of that moisture. That's why we're adding compost to really help um, neutralize and to help that soil retain moisture in a way that's really healthy for the root zone. And potting soil is more expensive because the ingredients, they have extra ingredients to make it drain quickly. And a lot of potting soils, or many potting soils, will have moisture retention beads in it, polymers, which we absolutely don't want in the ground. And those can also be problematic, especially during a wet season, because it's going to be holding too much water. So it's
Great.
just,
That
yeah, just good rule of thumb to only use potting soil for pots.
makes sense. Pamela is asking if you can show the exclusion frames again, are there pros or cons of each?
Um, Only pros, and the only cons is if we don't get the right material. So if we have rats getting into a raised bed, which is very common, we want to make sure we're not using poultry wire or chicken wire because they can just walk right through it. So we want to make sure we're using the 1/4 inch hardware cloth. It's a smaller caliber so that they can't fit through that. Um, but there's no, the only benefit is that we're using it so that we're protecting our food. This is the main way this is one of the main tools you'll see so many people using to manage their gardens. In fact, 4 of these pictures are in public, uh, like community gardens or public education gardens. So, yeah, this is the way we manage pests in the garden. So when you've got urban critters or vertebrates, little mammals that are there, like cats that might like to use the garden as a litter box, or squirrels that dig, or raccoons that can pull plants out, or rats that also like to dig and eat. The only way to keep them out is with exclusion.
And we have a question about when should fluot trees be pruned?
Mm. Fluots are also going to be pruned during the winter. So the time I prune, it's usually January, when it seems like there's a nice break after the long holidays, and there might be a couple of nice sunny days, and I get outside and I prune my fruit trees. And then I usually wait until like around the first week of February or so to prune roses or other flowering shrub that would benefit from pruning. So the fruit trees are always going, but you can start pruning as soon as the leaves have dropped.
Great. We're asking if you can go on the slide of the book.
Yeah. Oh, all of the books?
It says the recommended at the end, the
Yes.
books you recommended at the end.
Yeah. Golden Gate Gardening by Pam Pierce. How to Grow More Vegetables by John Jevons. And then there's also the Rodale publications. They've been around for decades. They have a really great book called The Book of Gardening, also one that's the Book of Composting. And I find them at the libraries a lot too. So any of the Rodale book publications, but Golden Gate Gardening would be my must have if that was the only book I could have for growing food. That would be my number one pick. And she just came out with a recent publication, an anniversary edition. Um, she's the garden writer for the SF Chronicle, or at least used to be. And yeah, she still does a lot of educational events around the Bay Area. Pam's really great, very knowledgeable, and her book is very user friendly, very easy to read, and it has really fun recipes.
Great. And just a friendly reminder that this whole webinar is recorded and we'll be sending the link. So if you guys want to look back at any of these slides, we'll have that soon. Nicholas wants to know, what zone are we in? The seed packets mentioned this for recommendations.
Um, you'll have to go on the USDS, like look up what zone you're in. I'm in 9A, but I'm in the North Bay. So I'm not sure where you would be. And I don't, and again, it depends on where we live, but you can easily get that information online, planting zones. And I also know that they recently just changed a little bit because of climate change. So I also wouldn't want to lead you astray.
Great. We do have a couple more minutes. If we have any other questions, please put them in the Q&A. You can also raise your hand and ask Suzanne directly.
I'll say one more thing about the seeds. If you're buying seeds from your local garden center, that supplier is only bringing in things that are going to thrive in that area. But if you're buying seeds online, then there is risk of possibly having something that doesn't work best for your microclimate. Keeping in mind, we live in the Bay Area, the greater Bay Area. Um, Even me in the North Bay, I'm still in the Bay Area. We have microclimates. That's why I started this program, kind of addressing the different types of nuances that we experience in our garden. Even from your neighbor a block away, you guys have different um, things going on in the garden, different sun exposure, different wind exposure, different soil in some cases. So, orientation of the garden in regards to the structures and the fence, it's all going to really be determined on that. And going back to Pam Pierce's book, Golden Gate Gardening, she goes into there's very large lists of plants that we can grow here, regardless of where you live. I mean, she covers beyond the Bay Area. So even though it's called Golden Gate Gardening, it's not just San Francisco or Marin, it's our entire greater Bay Area. So check that book out. It's pretty cool. Also, your local Master Gardener's website is going to have a planting guide and also some great information on uh, food crops that are going to grow really well here. But again, you want to cater it to your microclimate.
And from a quick search of Palo Alto, it looks like it's 9B.
9B. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions for Suzanne? We got a thank you very much for the great information from Molly. Thanks for joining us, Molly.
Thank you.
We have a couple more minutes if there's any remaining questions. We will be sending along the recording and Suzanne's contact information as well. All right, we're at 8:30 and I don't see any more questions. Thank you everyone for joining us for our last webinar of the season. Thank you, Suzanne, for hosting tonight, and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. Have a great night.